Morning, NSF. Welcome to our program this morning. I look forward to hearing your input on this. We will be discussing nuclear security in Ukraine. I have set up a series of panel discussions to address the gravity and the difficult situation that's happening in Ukraine. NSF will be rolling those out every 2 to 3 weeks on topics that are exceedingly important and maybe just behind the news. So we'll be covering topics in addition to nuclear security. We'll be looking at biological security. We'll be looking at the economic impacts. How is information getting in or out of Russia? Topics also include what China's likely response will be and what the implications are for Taiwan. So with that, I welcome our speakers to today's program, and I thank you for being here. I will introduce our speakers now, but they will introduce themselves as they get started. So Anya Fink from the Center for Naval Analysis will be presenting her thoughts on the nuclear security situation vis-a-vis the reactors, and also Vladimir Putin's nuclear escalation management strategy inside of Russia. Keith Hansen will then follow up with perspectives from the nuclear policy of the United States and what are some likely outcomes for the current situation. So with that, I welcome you. Thank you for being here. Please stay tuned as we will be rolling out these programs over the next several months. And if you have particular topics of interest that you would like me to cover, please drop me an email at mccarthy@nationalsecurityforum.org. So with that, we will get started. Thank you very much.
So with the current situation, according to the International Atomic Energy Agency, or the IAEA, 8 out of these 15 reactors are currently actually operating and connected to the grid. So the situation is moving very quickly, and I would say that the very best go-to resource on the current safety situation is really the IAEA. They have the facilities under safeguards, and they're in very close touch with Ukrainian regulators who kind of can, to an extent, monitor the situation at the facilities as it evolves. So, and then I have on that slide, so the best two resources are kind of the IAEA has been giving statements, and that's kind of their front page specifically devoted to the Ukraine conflict. And then on their Twitter site, they've also been giving updates of kind of, for example, this morning's news and kind of what their assessment of the situation is. So, and I think that kind of following that is really important, especially as you sort of ingest news from CNN and other places that kind of have their analysis, because I think the IAEA kind of has a technical background and the knowledge, and that really should be kind of the #1 place to go. So I would say the two facilities that have been involved most in the conflict are, the site at Zaporizhia, and the site of Chernobyl. So I'll talk about Zaporizhia first. So on March 2, Russian forces took over territory around the nuclear power plant site, which currently has 6 operational reactor units. They apparently notified the IAEA that radiation levels were made normal, and also added that personnel at the plant continued their work as normal. But then the situation started kind of progressing pretty quickly from there. So on March 3rd, the next day, there was active combat in a neighboring town of Enerhodar, which ended up cutting power to the facility from one of the 2 offsite power transmission lines that supplied electricity to the site. This particular power loss did not have an impact on safety, according to the IAEA. It did constrain some maintenance issues. And then on March 3rd, 4th, depending on kind of if you're in the US or in Europe, there were news of a fire at a training building at the facility following Russian shelling in the vicinity. And subsequently, Russian forces took over the plant. So on the slide, you'll see on the left one is you'll see the 6 reactor units, and then the arrow is pointing to the site that was at the training building that was damaged by shelling in the attack, and that kind of had the fire. And so you see the fire on the right. So the plant there thus became the first operating civil nuclear power plant to come under attack. But sort of the fire was put out, and everyone announced that, the radiation levels were normal at the plant. And since then, the IAEA has expressed concerns that the staff at the plant are under orders from the Russian military, which is a significant nuclear safety issue. And then much of the communication and internet was cut to the facility. And the Ukrainian regulator has also announced that it's been challenging to deliver spare parts for maintenance at the facility. And as of March 7th, according to the IEA, personnel at that facility have been able to rotate at the site. So that's actually been a positive development, but we'll see if it holds. And out of the 6 units at Zaporizhia, 2 are currently operational, with a 3rd one in cold shutdown. The cold shutdown started on March 7th, following the sort of some damage that was inflicted on the site in the March 4th attacks that did not touch the unit directly, but touched, I think, a kind of a transmission block or something. So there's 2 reactors are currently in operation with Russian military controlling the site.
Before, if I may interject, Anya, can you explain or elaborate on what you mean by Russian military in control of the site?
So they have physical control of the facility, the entrances and exits in the facility. And we don't actually know from open source how many people they have on the site. So, you know, what the number of people is at the site. It's a relatively large site, so presumably you'd need a lot of military personnel to actually be there and be able to control it. But so they're controlling the territory and presumably controlling entrances and exits and senior level people at the facility. So,
but they are letting,
as far as we know,
they're letting Ukrainian workers come and go. Are they letting IAEA into the site? Do you know?
So so far, I think as of reporting from either the 7th or the 8th of March from the IAEA, they have been allowing personnel to turn over at the facility. This is in contrast to what's been happening at Chernobyl. And then the IAEA monitors activity at the site, right? They safeguard the site, so they actually have sensors at the site, so they know what's going on in terms of the in terms of the security and safety. So this is, you know, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. So the situation at Chernobyl has been a little bit more troubling. As you know, all of the reactors at Chernobyl have been shut down and are not in operation. The accident in 1986 happened at the reactor unit 4, which is enclosed in a sarcophagus, right? So initially it was enclosed in a sarcophagus that was quickly built by the Soviet Union because there were 3 other operating nuclear power plants at the site. And so they wanted to make sure they could protect the operations of those reactors. But since then, there was a huge effort by the international community and the EU to build a new sarcophagus. And that was inaugurated, I believe, in 2017. So the image you see on the left, actually, the dome is this sort of new sarcophagus that when it was still under construction. So all of the reactor units at the sites are of the RBMK design, and they were all shut down in 2000. So with the accident happening in 1986, I think one was shut down in 91, one was in 96, and the last one was shut down in 2000. And also the thing to note is that in addition to kind of these reactors and the sarcophagus, there's also several fuel storage facilities at the plant, spent fuel facilities. And so those actually are the things that remain in operation at the site. So the timeline of events at Chernobyl is as follows. On 24 of February, Russian forces took control of all the facilities at the site. And since then, really, Ukraine's nuclear regulators and the IAEA's concern has been that all personnel at that facility, which is about 210 people, have not been allowed to rotate, and they've been on site since. And so that's a couple of weeks now. We also know that from the IAEA that their communication has been cut, so they're only able to communicate via email. And we also know that a couple of days ago, all material handling, presumably at the storage facilities, has been suspended. And then kind of news have been trickling out slowly over the last couple of days. So on March 8th, the IAEA said that it lost remote transmission of data from the safeguards monitoring system that are at the site. So the question was why? And then on March 9th, the Ukrainian regulator actually formally informed the IAEA that there was a power loss at the Chernobyl site. So presumably that explains, you know, the remote data transmission loss to an extent. And so as of several hours ago, what the IAEA has been saying about this power loss is that the heat load of spent fuel storage pool and volume of cooling water at the nuclear power plant is sufficient so far for effective heat removal. And so there's no need for electrical supply. In kind of basic terms, at this point, they're not really concerned about a fire or sort of anything else happening with the spent fuel at the site. But that's kind of as of a couple hours ago. And so we'll see how the situation continues to evolve and sort of what we also know about the data loss that still kind of continues. Again, there's lots of worrying reporting out there, and the IAEA remains the best resource probably to go to. They've been very responsive. And also at the IAEA website, you'll find some other very interesting information about other sites that have been damaged in the fighting, not nuclear reactors, but things like a radioactive source facility that handles Cat 1 through 3 radioactive sources and sort of other, other things that could potentially be more troubling. And so I think when we think about NPPs, the key thing to remember, right, is that they are, not all of them are operating, but any one of those things involved in an active war is potentially very dangerous. And so the big question is, why are the Russians taking over these facilities? And so my answer to that is really very basic. It's territory that they want to hold as they're moving forward, right? That's number one. And that really explains the situation in Chernobyl. Second, it's critical infrastructure. So if you actually wanted to impact electricity production or anything else, that's really the first, the first targets you want to hold. You also want to be able to protect them, right? That way you control that infrastructure and protect anything happening to it, which seems counterintuitive, again, given what Russian military actions have inflicted at those facilities. The thing that really is to keep in mind is that, as we know, Chernobyl affected not just Ukraine, but also Belarus, right? So any radioactive release or accident at any of these facilities imperils Russia and Russia, right? Depending on where the wind is blowing. So I suspect they're very cognizant of that, kind of keeping that in mind. I know that's not incredibly reassuring given what we've seen so far, but it's something also to keep in mind. So, and I am also happy to chat in the Q&A about this issue and also defer to more technical colleagues.
So just a few things on the Chernobyl site, because obviously there's a lot of concern about that. What are the primary concerns is one, in terms of, sustained period of time being without power, which they are now. And in Zaporizhzhia, the concern was potential loss of power, potential loss of cooling. If you could go through the two sites in comparison as to what are the major concerns. And then the last question I have for you is, are there any indications or do you have any reporting on nuclear experts coming in from Russia to potentially operate these facilities? Is their goal to take over these facilities, to operate them, potentially shut them down? What's the end game here?
So let me answer your second question first. I haven't heard any reporting about nuclear experts coming in from Russia to operate these facilities. I suspect if these people were needed, they would come. But I also suspect that every facility has its own quirks and kind of the ways it operates. Right. It has a culture, right? Safety and security. So I mean, if the IAEA is already expressing concerns about safety at a lot of these facilities, any kind of foreign personnel in this case would be a major sort of safety issue for them as well. So I suspect that for the time being, they're just going to make do with local staff. And I think the sort of the big concern with Chernobyl, right, is the inability of that staff to turn over and actually get rest, right? Because that impacts maintenance of the site and that sort of, people who have been on site and presumably working in some sort of shift arrangement for 2 weeks, they're really not, especially under duress in this situation, they're really not in a kind of fit state to be able to maintain that facility. Well, so this is the part where I think your first question is enough to get me in trouble, right? So I've been watching this morning kind of this, I'm in a couple of groups where people are discussing the sort of the technical merits of the concerns at both of these facilities, right? And so when I see folks who have nuclear physics backgrounds debating these issues, that's fascinating and kind of disagreeing about sort of the technical specs and also how much we know about what's happening at each of the facilities. Well, from what I understand, with Zaporizhzhia, right? So you have if you have loss of cooling to an operating reactor, that's much more dangerous potentially, right? So that kind of puts us in a situation of a potential meltdown. But so far we haven't had that, right? So all of the reactors have backup power, and so far the backup power has been operating. Right, with Chernobyl, I suspect the concern much more because these are not operational reactors, right? So the concern is really about the sort of the spent fuel and how much spent fuel is left in those spent fuel facilities, and sort of what is the temperature of that spent fuel, right? Is it cool enough, and how much water is in that pool that's kind of cooling that? And so far, as the IAEA has said, that so far they're not concerned about a potential safety situation in that specific site.
Right, and of course we have spent fuel at Zaporizhzhia as well.
Yes.
So it's not just at Chernobyl. The prospective end game, though, what seems to be the object of from your taking off your nuclear security hat, putting on your Russian military hat. What's the military objective here? Is it to, is it just because it was in the way and they wanted control? I mean, the Chernobyl facility is a fairly huge chunk of land. So it's not like you couldn't have gone around it. What is the military objective of taking control of these sites?
I mean, it's both, right? It's territory. It's a big chunk of territory that's divided, that's enclosed by fences, right? So you want to be able to hold that, so you don't have to worry about what's behind you in very many kind of basic territory terms. But also, again, the active nuclear power plants are critical infrastructure. So presumably, if you have control over that, that impacts morale in the neighboring communities. You can actually kind of have impact on critical infrastructure, and then holding it also, again, counterintuitively protects it. Right, so they can say that we were in charge when this happened or did not happen, and that way, in their minds, they're also protecting any of these facilities from sabotage or kind of any of these other things that could potentially happen and be blamed on them later. So I would argue that these are kind of the sort of the justifications they're potentially using and thinking through as they're holding these. The latter two kind of portions of my presentation will kind of focus very briefly on two divergent topics, as I mentioned, right? So first is Belarus and nuclear weapons. So Belarus has played a very interesting role in this conflict, right? The Russian forces that came from Belarus after a joint Russian-Belarusian exercise, clearly were pre-staging there and kind of doing stuff there. But so far, Belarus has acted like it has nothing to do with this conflict, right? But at the same time, I think Lukashenko, especially since, the protest movements in Belarus and sort of the Russian support for leadership, he's really been playing a very interesting role in kind of getting closer to Putin and kind of making sure that this Russian dream of a union state that Russia has been talking to Belarus about for, over a decade or two, kind of still lives on in a weird way, even though she's sort of pushing back on that idea of a union state. And so what do we know about Belarus and its nuclear weapons, Belarus and its weapons of mass destruction? So first thing to note is that Belarus has no WMD, right? When the Soviet Union collapsed, Belarus eventually transferred all of its Soviet-era warheads to Russia. It also does not possess biological or chemical warfare programs. And so in 1991, there was about 80 SS-25s at 3 missile bases in Belarus. And Belarus also had some unknown number of tactical nuclear weapons. So all of those weapons, when the Soviet Union collapsed, were in Belarusian territory. And we also know that in the 80s, there was a unit with intermediate range ballistic missiles that was stationed in Belarus, but all of those weapons were eliminated as part of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty by 1991. So there was kind of that active effort. And so after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was an effort to remove weapons out of Belarus, Ukraine, and sort of some of the other states that hosted not just the weapons, but the production infrastructure for Soviet Union's nuclear weapons. And so in 1993, Belarus did two things, right? It acceded to the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, and it also acceded to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons as a non-nuclear weapon state. And so by 1996, as part of US cooperative threat reduction programs and other efforts, Belarus transferred all of its nuclear weapons and related infrastructure to Russia as kind of part of those agreements. And so in operational terms, by 1996, when that transfer happened, Belarus was a non-nuclear weapon state as part of the NPT. And so there's been no nuclear forces stationed in Belarus since that time. There was kind of nuclear, the possibility of hosting Russian nuclear weapons played a role in kind of Belarusian internal debates in the 90s. and sort of until Lukashenko raised this issue again in late 2021. And so the thing to note is that, again, Belarus has sort of nothing. There's no active productive infrastructure, production infrastructure, or sort of anything that could allow it to indigenously make anything, right? So in December of 2001, Alexander Lukashenko went on Russian state television, and as part of a lengthy interview, he essentially offered to host a Russian nuclear weapon on Belarus's territory. And so as part of the process to potentially enable that to happen, there was a change in Belarusian constitution that sort of came into effect at the end of February. So among Russian analysts that I've seen cover this issue, there's been sort of incredible skepticism about exactly what could be stationed in Belarus, right? Because Russia has absolutely no interest or need to put its strategic nuclear forces in Belarus. Russian ICBMs and bombers are perfectly fine where they are in Russia. Russia also has centralized nuclear warhead storage sites, kind of not too far from Belarus. So even if there's kind of any contemplation of putting anything there, there's potentially not necessarily any need. But at the same time, Lukashenko has also shown pretty significant interest in Russian Iskander missiles, which are short-range ballistic missile systems, and in some cases, potentially cruise missiles. And so if potentially there's any ever talk of Russian nuclear weapons in Belarus, these systems could potentially be candidate systems. But again, this raises a ton of different questions because Russia wouldn't really transfer warheads to Belarus, right? Because Russian nuclear safety and security warhead handlers at the 12th GUBO need to be the ones operating and sort of touching those warheads, and it can't be Belarusians in this case, right? And so that also raises questions about, did Belarus actually operate any of the weapons that it had from the, in the Soviet days? And the answer to that's probably no. And so I would look at a lot of these discussions currently about stationed nuclear weapons in Belarus with kind of an increased degree of skepticism. I think there's a lot of international angle to this, right? Because anything that Belarus does also impacts its standing in the nuclear non-proliferation regime. So I wouldn't really view this with a lot of concern. So this is kind of my last point as we transition to Keith. There's been a lot of talk about potential Russian nuclear employment in this conflict. So I wanted to spend a minute on this. So we know that Putin made veiled nuclear threats aimed at forestalling any Western intervention into Ukraine prior to the invasion. But his statement, particularly on February 27th, caused a lot of alarm. And so Putin said that he was ordering a special service regime of Russian strategic deterrent forces, given hostility of NATO leaders, as well as potential sort of sanctions. This triggered a lot of speculation in the news. I think it was a Sunday, and I was enjoying my Sunday until I realized that something was happening. Some, including apparently the Kremlin, though we can't verify it because the Kremlin site is down, actually translated this special service regime as a high nuclear alert, which that definitely wasn't the case. Those of us following Russian nuclear weapons pretty closely were puzzled by this announcement because we actually don't know what a special service regime is, and we definitely know that it's not high alert, right? And so what I kept thinking at the time was, if the United States government announces that it's actually seeing things in terms of changes in Russian force posture, we should be concerned, but otherwise we should really not be concerned. And so USG has said several times in press briefings that there's been no active change in Russian force posture to date. And then TASS also on February 27th announced that this was about sort of increased manning. So the only thing that has happened on the open source side is that this has really been about increased manning at kind of key Russian launch sites. But this still raises the question of when could Russia use nuclear weapons? So we did a study a couple of years back on Russian approaches to escalation management. This is a very busy slide, but it's really just here for any question and answer for us if you want to go back to it. So the key things to note here is that Russian military doctrine divides conflict into several types: local, regional, and large-scale wars. And so nuclear employment is envisioned in regional and large-scale wars. The conflict with Ukraine is a local conflict. So the judgment for the Russians is really about when does this local conflict escalate into a regional conflict. So a regional conflict is one that involves the US and NATO allies. And I'm happy to chat about Russian nuclear doctrine or military doctrine in the question and answer session. And so I think the assessment challenge here is figuring out how the Russians are judging the impact of economic sanctions and any lethal aid to Ukraine, or shifts in US or NATO declaratory policy, right? So are those things really challenging Russian sovereignty, kind of their statehood, and kind of the implications of that? But I'd say that so far, at least up to the present, on the open source side, in terms of nuclear weapons, I haven't been worried about it too much. So I'll transition it to Keith.
So yeah, just before we do that, and I appreciate your I'll leave this slide up for a second because I'm sure a lot of people are reading it carefully. The concept of engaging NATO, does that move local into regional?
So whenever Russian forces are in active conflict with US or NATO forces, that automatically transitions the conflict in scope and scale. So how Russians also understand conflict is that local conflict has limited goals, right? So it's a small conflict between two neighboring states that has limited political goals. Regional conflict starts having slightly larger goals, right? Because a larger number of states is involved. And then when you transition to large scale wars, it's obviously kind of potentially wars in several theaters, but also it views as states parties in the conflict as having, different political and military goals, so not limited. And so I think that also becomes a question for us as we sort of domestically debate the appropriateness of fly zone and kind of some of these other issues. When we start talking about the legitimacy of the Putin government, does that push our rhetoric into them being concerned about us potentially wanting to do regime change? And so that's the other kind of factor that plays into this a little bit. So not just sort of sanctions, lethal aid, but also this conversation about regime change, because when we start talking about that, that's kind of radical political military goals, and that's how they will read that.
And so we have this perception, and certainly a lot has been discussed about, not going into a conflict with another state with a large number of nuclear weapons. Where do we fit into this? Do they have that same kind of red line that, it's one thing to be in a conflict with Ukraine or potentially even the Baltic states or the non-nuclear elements of NATO, but triggering the US, do they have a red line that we don't want to go into conflict with the United States because of their nuclear arsenal?
Absolutely, right. So I think there is this kind of, I think the Russians have had a longstanding concern that the US is seeking to get out of this, this mutual vulnerability arrangement that we've had since the Cold War, right, that we agreed on after the Cuban Missile Crisis, as the narrative goes. I think the debate about the US nuclear umbrella over NATO allies is a very interesting and longstanding debate, right? Why do we have nuclear weapons in Europe? We have them to deter the Russians, but we also have them to assure allies. And so I think depending on kind of where you are in Europe, you'll have different perspectives on how safe you feel and kind of what are other things the US can do with nuclear weapons, or other countries in NATO can do with nuclear weapons to actually make allies feel a little more secure. But so aside from kind of Putin's revanchist or other ideas about Ukraine, looking at the Russian military, the part that they were concerned about is kind of the possibility of Ukraine becoming a NATO state or kind of other state that hosts kind of strategic capabilities, not just nuclear, but strategic capabilities. So that is a key part of concern in sort of the slice of the Russian decision-making cycle. And so I would argue that that is particularly the point, right, is they don't want nuclear weapons to be too close to them because they're concerned about a potential attack, but also they perceive that nuclear weapons are a credible deterrent in very many ways. So, yeah.
Excellent. Thank you, Anya. Keith, I'm going to turn to you. I remind all the NSF folks that if you have questions, please put them either in the chat or the Q&A box, and I will be looking at them as I'm navigating slides. So don't mind me if I'm going back and forth. So Keith, perhaps you can pick up the thread on that and I will bring up your slides. You want your nuclear threat slides first, correct?
Please. Yes, yes.
Okay. So pulling the thread on that and coming back to to U.S. nuclear policy and nuclear perception of threats.
Yes, thank you, Maureen, for the chance to add a few thoughts, and thank you, Anya, for the work that you're doing and your friends at CNA. That's nice to know that people are giving some good thought to these kinds of questions. What I want to pick up on is a little bit, I labeled it Putin's nuclear threat. We're not sure what he was talking about, as you explained carefully, but let's dig in a little bit. Let's talk about nuclear weapon use policy generically, but principally in the U.S. And Anya, please feel free to chime in on this at any time. But nuclear weapons, they're not battlefield weapons. They are really strategic deterrent weapons. That's how we have used them in the past, except for the attack in Japan, obviously. But in the Cold War context, the only time nuclear weapons might be used would be in the European theater, facing an overwhelming Soviet superiority in conventional forces. We laid down a nuclear tripwire, saying that we would deploy essentially tactical nuclear weapons to stop the advance of the Soviet troops into NATO Europe. But otherwise, our nuclear weapons are there to deter, to tell the other side the potential threat. It's not worth your while to attack us with nuclear weapons or with massive, overwhelming conventional force, because the pain on you will be too great. And that's what Anya referred to. This mutual assured destruction concept has been in play, and it's still there. It's still there. Now, if Putin and the Russian military did increase the alert status of their nuclear forces, that does necessarily increase the risk of somebody making a mistake, because now your ability to compensate for that mistake, your timelines have been reduced considerably. And we know that during the Cold War, when we at times would put our forces at high alert, there were some mistakes made. You misunderstand, your computers screw up, and you misunderstand what's happening out there. And so it increases the danger that an unintended use of a nuclear weapon could transpire. But as Anya said, we're not sure what Putin was referring to. And I think I have to say, I'm not sure where Putin is and his military leaders on their use policy. I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt and say they're as cautious as we are, because they realize the consequences of unleashing a nuclear exchange would spoil everybody's day. So I would think, and Anya, if you want to chime on this, I think basically they're in the deterrent stance that we're in, unless things really get to be an extremely dangerous situation for them, then they react as they feel they need to.
So before you move on, I'm going to ask Anya, do you have a response back to Keith? And then Keith, I'm going to come back to you with a second question, which is, and I think I asked you to take this out, and I'm going to ask you to put it back in on the fly. Can you explain the difference between strategic and tactical nuclear weapons, and what the status of our nuclear arsenal is in Europe? So Anya, to you first.
I'm gonna say, I think I'll start by saying it, but I think it's a great segue to what Keith is going to talk about in response to your question, right? So I think there's this longstanding debate, that endured during the Cold War and still endures to this day about limited nuclear options, right? Do we have limited nuclear options? What do we need our non-strategic nuclear weapons for? Do our adversaries have limited nuclear options? And so what we've seen on the Russian side is this sort of interest in having more limited nuclear options that began kind of after the Cold War, ended to an extent, right? They had them before, but then there was kind of philosophical debates about usability in the Soviet Union, to kind of them getting to a significant period of conventional weakness in the 1990s and kind of growing in terms of reliance on non-strategic nuclear weapons. So them pushing out and trying to develop conventional capabilities that could get them out of that problem of relying too much on non-strategic nuclear weapons, right? Because ideally, they want to be able to control escalation in a way where they're not reliant on nuclear weapons, right? So they're not reliant on potentially putting their own people in harm's way even more than they are in a conflict. And so I think it's kind of important to think about that part of it here, right? When does the military recommend nuclear use? Kind of, are they in a sort of a dire state of situation? And I think the Russian military doctrine provides some clues to this, right? So we know sort of in situations where they perceive kind of great significant threat to the state. If there's like a loss of territory, if Russian critical objects, particularly ones that are involved in the operation of nuclear weapons, are involved, or obviously Russia has, officially they have a launch on warning posture, but they also, we know, plan for launch under attack. So which means they can operate their forces in sort of several configurations, and their force mix is such that it should allow them to actually be able to do one or the other in a given situation, meaning they have mobile missiles and submarines to allow them to kind of operate after launch under attack. And then their other capabilities allow them to potentially launch on warning. And so I'll kind of stop there. But I think in terms of kind of the political decision-making calculus, I think that's where we get into this uncertainty about kind of who makes the decisions about nuclear use and in what circle, right? We know for a fact that Putin isn't going to be the only person making that decision, right? As we know from open source potentially, that you need at least two people to kind of interact with a nuclear briefcase when you're doing launch orders, even though all of Russian doctrinal documents say that Putin, is the president is the person that makes that nuclear use decision. But I suspect there has to be some sort of military recommending nuclear options to the leadership, as opposed to just leadership saying, I woke up on the wrong side of the bed. Today is the day we're going to use nuclear weapons. So.
And is the Russian policy on nuclear weapons different for strategic intercontinental ballistic missiles, war with the US, versus potentially the use of small-scale tactical weapons that could damage Europe? Is there a difference in policy, or is it the same policy?
Yes, there's a difference in policy. And the difference in policy is because they persist in an environment where Russia is conventionally inferior to the whole of US and NATO conventional capabilities combined, right? And so they perceive their non-strategic nuclear weapons as being important to deter the sort of the totality of US and NATO conventional capability. And that's why nuclear weapons, non-strategic nuclear weapons, come into play when they think about fighting a regional war, is because they simply don't have enough conventional assets to be able to strike targets. And they start looking to other means to destroy targets and not just to deter. So, yes.
It's interesting what you describe, Anya, because it's the reverse, isn't it, of what we had in the Cold War, with NATO facing the overwhelming Warsaw Pact conventional forces on the border of NATO. But I think you mentioned escalation control. I think that's a critical one. Nobody knows. We don't know. The Russians don't know. If you use a single tactical nuclear weapon, what are you unleashing? Can you control what happens next? And the fear has been always that you would very quickly escalate up to using your intercontinental, your strategic nuclear weapon systems. And then of course, the game is lost for everybody. So that's the real danger of military planning for the use of tactical weapons. And I'll come to your question in a minute, Maureen. Yeah, because once you unleash one, now what do you do? How do you put the genie back in the bottle? And it's really tough. And the good news is, I think, that during the Cold War, both the US and the USSR developed, certainly in their strategic arsenals, fairly complementary, equivalent types of systems. So they had the ability to retaliate, even if if there was a preemptive attack. And you could launch under attack because you had survivable nuclear capabilities that would not be in danger of being destroyed by a first strike. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of commonality there in the two as they eventually, and I think when you think of it getting back into the late 60s, when we started talking to the Soviets for the first time about strategic arms limitation talks before SALT I started in 69, it was because both were realizing, you know, there was no place to go. We had more than we needed, and it was crazy having it all. And you know, there just doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason how you can launch, fight, and win a nuclear war and control what's going on during that war. And I can remember even going to debates in the Pentagon. It was still, even in the 70s and the 80s, there was still debate raging among US policymakers, defense policymakers. Do the Soviets think they can launch, fight, and win a nuclear war? Because how are you going to control it? You know, how are you going to avoid the worst consequences of being the first one to use a nuclear weapon? So in any case, enough of that. But Maureen, back to your question, just sort of general. When we think of Soviet, now I'm going back to my Cold War days, sorry. When we think of strategic nuclear weapons on either side, Russian or US, we're thinking of ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, that have the range to go from one country to the other across, you know, half the globe. We're thinking of strategic bombers that could fly with refueling and so on, launch cruise missiles, drop bombs, whatever, and go the distance. We're thinking of submarines that are basically survivable because they're very clandestine, they're hiding out, and they can launch from wherever they decide to launch from. All right, so with the New START agreement, I believe both countries now have reduced from the Cold War high of, I think we had 10,000 strategic nuclear warheads online. The Soviets had 12,000, I think. But, you know, what's 2,000 when you're in those numbers? All right. Now we're down to, after several slices of it, with START 1, abortive START 2, the SORT treaty, and then the New START, we're down to about 1,500. So 1,500 strategic nuclear warheads on bombers, submarine, ballistic missiles, and intercontinental ballistic missiles, land-based, whether they're mobile or stationary, irrelevant, except for potentially survivability. Okay, so there we are, 1,500 on each side, still enough to spoil everybody's day. So for those people who are anti-nuclear weapons and want zero, it's not good enough. For those of us who were worried about 10,000 warheads coming our direction, it gives you some relief. It's at least a more manageable threat than we used to have, okay? So when you talk about those, and then, Maureen, the strategic or the tactical, we had actually three layers of nuclear range capabilities. We had the strategic, met the intercontinental. We had the intermediate range, which Anya had referred to, the INF systems, which we successfully negotiated out of existence, essentially, in the late 80s with the INF treaty. And then you have the tactical. And the tactical is a real mixture of stuff. The Navy has warheads, or they have nuclear bombs on carriers that they can launch and attack a nuclear strike from an aircraft carrier anywhere in the world the carrier might be. The Army has nuclear artillery shells that can be shot out of cannons, et cetera, okay? The Army at one time had the Pershing 1 missiles, which were short-range missiles, ballistic missiles. They were replaced by the intermediate range Pershing 2s, but you got bombs, you got warheads that can be put on aircraft, they can be put on mobile systems, they can put in cannons, they can be launched. And that's what we mean by tactical. I mean, it's battlefield. You're being attacked, you try to stop the opposition from coming at you, okay, with nuclear weapons. Now, what's the inherent danger of that? It's ludicrous. Once the weapons go off and the bad things are released out of those weapons, everybody suffers, right? So how are you going to survive a tactical strike and a tactical exchange of weapons? And this is going to another theater of conflict. That is the India-Pakistan border. You know, people say, well, India has nuclear weapons to defend itself against Pakistan. No, it doesn't need nuclear weapons. It has overwhelming conventional force. It can wipe Pakistan out if it wants to. Pakistan needs nuclear weapons to deter India, all right? But if either one of them should use nuclear weapons in the Kashmir area on their border, guess who's going to suffer? With prevailing winds, they're both going to suffer millions of casualties. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. So battlefield use of nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons, I think only makes sense if you're trying to deter, and then if your deterrence fails, then you got to control the escalation of the use of nuclear weapons. And I don't think that's really doable. And I hope we never have an opportunity to figure it out, because it would be an unhappy day.
Thank
That's all I
you,
think, Dan.
Keith. So one last question for you. Does the
Yeah.
U.S. maintain tactical nuclear weapons in Europe?
I believe they're all gone now.
Yes.
We pulled those
They are
out.
gone.
George H.W. Bush in the early 90s, at the end of the Cold War, decided to pull them out. As far as I know, and I've been too many years outside, Anya, maybe you know differently, so please speak up. We basically pulled them out. All right.
Anya?
We do have B-6112 gravity bombs at
Oh, we do? Okay.
sites in Europe, including in Germany, Turkey, and a couple of other ones, I believe.
Okay, for aircraft
Yes.
delivery.
For aircraft delivery.
Aircraft
yeah.
delivery.
Yep, and they've been upgraded recently.
Okay,
And so
all
that
right.
number is the NATO deterrent assurance force, and that's in addition to kind of the weapons that the UK and the French have.
Yeah, well, yeah, I didn't address the French and the UK as part of NATO, but yes, in terms of US weapons, thanks for clarifying that. Okay, I was not up to date. Okay, next slide.
Yeah, I'm going to move to your next slide, but I'm going to interject a couple questions that we're getting from our audience because they're relevant, and some of this you may be covering. So Anya, perhaps back to you on the escalation charts. Those were mostly perceived of as internal threats. How would Putin view, or I mean, external threats? How would Putin view the fear of potentially internal opposition? Does that change the calculus of what he is willing to do to an external adversary if he feels that he's, being threatened internally?
It's an interesting question. I think this is where we get into we try to get into the adversary's mind and figure out kind of how they think, which is a challenging endeavor, I think, on the best of days.
Yeah.
But I think, there's been increased concern ever since Arab Spring and sort of the movements in that second decade of the 2010s, like in the 2010s, right, towards peaceful protests against power in Europe and the Middle East. And so I think, and in Russia, right? So I think there's been increased concern about domestic stability and the impact that could potentially have on the regime, right? And so you've seen a lot of kind of domestic moves in Russia to be able to control something like that, right? To increase in domestic internal security, creation of sort of specific agencies to deal with that, kind of harsher and harsher approaches to protesters, shutting down of media, kind of some of these other things, and also kind of more control of elections since then, right? And so the narrative has been that anytime there's domestic instability, that domestic instability has to be stoked externally, right? So there's no domestic instability in Russia except for one that is stoked externally. And you've actually seen that narrative to some extent play out in Belarus. Right. You've seen that narrative in Kazakhstan, right? With all this sort of the statements that, oh, this was not homebred, this was kind of externally influenced. And so I suspect that's kind of where that calculus gets really tricky. Do they suspect it's something internal, or do they really believe in kind of whatever state of mind they are that it's external? But even in that type of situation, if the government is losing control, the question is, what are they going to do with nuclear weapons in that type of a situation? And I would argue it's probably not much. So.
Excellent. So then one more question for you before Keith continues, and probably Anya, this is mostly to you. Given the what appears to be challenges that the Russian military has had, lack of competency, maybe we could say, in the invasion force and the conventional forces, do we have reason to believe that their nuclear forces are better organized, under better command and control than what appears to have been fairly significant military flaws in their conventional forces in the invasion?
So one thing I'll say is that, I have colleagues tracking the kind of the conventional, the sort of what's happening day to day, right? And so what my colleagues are saying is that, this is the Russian military that showed up to fight is really not the Russian military you expected. And that's sort of for several reasons. Key, you see one is they're not really fighting in kind of a combined arms operation that we would have envisioned them fighting against kind of a US NATO situation, right? So they're fighting the way they were fighting kind of with these smaller groups that were very disjointed without using air power or kind of electronic warfare, or some of these other much more sophisticated capabilities that they would bring to bear in a fight against US NATO. So that's question number one. And second, it's clear there's a lack of kind of intelligence preparation of actually the troops about what they were doing. And that has pretty significant implications for morale. So like if the soldiers don't really know that they're going to fight against, there's people who, who some of them speak their own language, it's a very sort of challenging situations that they put their own forces in. And so that's why you've seen the desertion rates, kind of some of these other things and concerns about the troops actually being able to perform their jobs. And so I think I wouldn't discount the Russian military just yet, right? They still have a lot of power. They have a lot of firepower, which is why the situation is getting kind of more dangerous by the day for civilians. It's because the longer this continues, the sort of the more destruction it's gonna bring to bear. So that's kind of on the conventional side. On the nuclear side, so the Russians have a nuclear triad of ICBMs, SSBMs, and bombers. And all of their nuclear weapons handling is conducted by kind of a special agency that does that, right? So that agency has existed since the Soviet days, and the U.S. taxpayers actually worked pretty close, through money paid by U.S. taxpayers. The U.S. government has actually worked with that agency to make sure that like they understand the practices and kind of there's commonalities and how the two sides approach and sort of understand the approach in terms of nuclear security. So I wouldn't be concerned about sort of the warhead side of it in terms of professionalism for the nuclear forces on a day-to-day basis. It's an interesting question. I think we sometimes have concerns on our side about that as well, right? So are the folks who are training to sit in those missile silos? What is their day-to-day life? Is it mundane? Do they sit and just kind of push buttons during exercises? And so I think that is something potentially to be concerned about, but hopefully we don't ever get to really test that in an actual conflict. So I would just stop there.
Okay, great. Thanks, Anya. So for NSFers, please put your comments and questions in either the chat or Q&A box. I have no ability to have participants speak, so please use the chat box or the Q&A box if you have a question. So Keith, please continue.
I just wanted to continue just to remind people, it's pretty obvious, but if you haven't been thinking about it, as in the Cold War, as today, Russia sees itself surrounded by potentially hostile nuclear weapon states, including China. Remember, China and Russia have fought each other conventionally on their borders in Asia, even though politically the two leaders seem to have sufficient commonality of anti-US venom in their system that they want to join together to cooperate against US interests. But still, there's this inherent suspicion in Russia about France and the UK, as well as the US, which have nuclear teeth. All right. So my sense is when Putin made this undescribable comment about his nuclear posture, I think he was just trying to remind the rest of the world, particularly NATO, particularly nuclear weapons armed NATO, that, I have nuclear weapons. So, you may be surrounding me, but just remember, I'm well armed and I've got a deterrent capability, so don't mess with me. And I think that was largely in response to the severity of the sanctions as they were coming on. The comments were made, the international condemnation of him and Russia for what they were doing. So I think it was really posturing, to answer the question right up front. But what if he does move tactical nukes into Belarus? Why would he do that? What would he gain? Well, I could see him in his state of mind and perhaps another shade of desperation because things are not going as well as he had hoped in the Ukraine and the condemnation that's come upon him, that he could push some of his tactical weapons back into Belarus under Russian control. Now, of course, this would contravene Belarus's NPT declaration, but Putin would say, well, screw it, I don't care. I want to put more pressure on NATO. I want to show NATO that, don't mess with me. I'm doing what I feel I need to do in Ukraine. You don't like it, but that's just tough. It's my backyard. I will do what I please to do for my own purposes. All right. So if he were to move things into Belarus, I think he would be just upping the posture. Don't mess with me. If necessary, I can get you faster than you can get me. So how would NATO respond to that? Well, we know how NATO responded after a lot of agonizing debate in the early 80s to the intermediate range nuclear threat to NATO, Europe, NATO countries, by deploying counter systems, which basically then forced the Soviets to get rid of their intermediate range nuclear forces. And we got rid of ours as well because we had kind of blunted the threat that was there. And it was I think, on the part of the Soviets trying to decapitate NATO Europe from the US, because they would say, okay, we can take out the European NATO countries. Now, US, are you going to retaliate with your strategic weapons against us, since we haven't launched any against you, just to save your NATO partners? So that mentality may still be alive and well within the Kremlin and could be forcing Putin to consider at least pushing TAC nukes into Belarus, just to raise the threat against NATO and let them know, look, I've showed you I'm willing to use my conventional forces to protect my national security. You don't know whether I'll use my tactical nukes to do the same. So keep NATO off balance. And my last line is sort of a throwaway, but I think more likely than raising the nuclear threat, that Putin and his buddies will just increase the cyber threat against NATO.
So question
yeah.
for you, Keith, before we hop to the last slide. And I think this is it's an excellent question. This kind of conventional warfare with veiled and unveiled nuclear threats between the US and Russia and Europe is raising the profile of the role of nuclear weapons in terms of supremacy in the battle space, or even attention in the world order. What are we looking at if we fast forward in terms of proliferation? Do you think this exchange in the long term is going to drive more countries to want to have nuclear weapons so they can use that as their trump card when they get into a conflict with potentially anybody? Is this really going to put us in a different place than we've been in terms of the proliferation regime? So I'll throw that out to Keith or Anya. Who wants to take it first?
Yeah, I'll respond to that. I don't see a significant risk of increased proliferation as a result of what's happening in this part of the world at the moment. Keep in mind, in 1973, in the Middle East War, both we and the Soviets increased the alert status of their nuclear forces. And what they were communicating to each other, don't go farther. Don't challenge our interests in the Middle East because you're going to put yourself at risk. So there was posturing going on. So nuclear posturing is not a new phenomenon. Okay, it's been used in the past at least once, and I'm sure there are a few other times. Proliferation, yes, is a risk. And we know, for example, that the Saudis, the Egyptians, and some others have told us if Iran gets nuclear weapon capability, we also want it. All right. So there's a real risk of proliferation in the Middle East arena, depending on what happens with the Iranian nuclear program. In Europe, at one time, Sweden had a nuclear weapon program, and other countries had nuclear weapon programs. But because of what Anya had mentioned, our nuclear umbrella, we convinced them they did not need to go to the expense or the risk of going down that road. We got your back. We'll take care of you. So I don't see that there are any other countries in NATO that would want to have their own nuclear weapon capability. They don't really need it. We've got them covered. Now, who else would you think might, I mean, some other areas of the world might think, well, we can't trust Russia in Europe, we can't trust Russia in Asia, maybe
Japan,
in that context.
Japan can't trust China.
Well, the question about Japan, can they trust the US?
Yeah, there's that.
All right, does the US really have our back? And that has been a question that the Japanese have asked periodically vis-a-vis North Korea in particular. But I don't think I don't see it falling out of this particular conflict.
Excellent.
Right.
Anya, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I'll just add. So I think any existing proliferation dynamics that we see in sort of Asia or the Middle East, they come out of sort of existing longstanding issues in those specific regions, right? So I would say that, you know, the 2014 crisis, you know, and the crisis around Ukraine, and Russia also engaged in sort of some coercive nuclear rhetoric. Right, there's great reports that have been written about that. So, by itself, you know, coercive nuclear rhetoric without explicit signaling is really nothing new. And we saw no, I think, ripples of proliferation dynamics. I think what some people are really concerned about is kind of loose nuclear rhetoric, right? And we've seen that, you know, not just from Putin, but also from, you know, from North Korea, and in some cases, you know, even us sometimes. So I think that's where it kind of the rubber meets the road, is like how willing are leaders at the highest levels to sort of throw around threats and kind of invoke their nuclear weapons, and for what purpose.
So Maureen, let me just, because Anya has basically covered this, just throw out a couple of thoughts, but I really want to get to the next set of slides.
Yep. Go ahead.
You know, what, as Anya said, what are Putin's goals? What's the military goal with these nuclear reactors? The two she talked about, but the others. Anya, I'd like to have your thoughts about this. I'm not sure Putin himself ordered, you know, what has happened at those two nuclear power plants. It may have been more of a tactical decision by the commanders in the field. And I was thinking, is it possible they are concerned that as they encounter and have witnessed now, maybe unexpectedly, the amount of resistance they've gotten from the Ukrainians, that there could be a radiological weapon risk against Russian forces in Ukraine. In other words, unless the Russians control those facilities, thinking of the spent fuel rods and other things, it doesn't take a lot of radioactive material to make a crude, dirty bomb, you know, weapon that they could use to contaminate the Russian troops. Do you think there's any fear on the part of the Russian military on the ground in Ukraine that for their own protection and self-preservation, they needed to deny Ukraine any access to any of that nuclear material?
I mean, that's a great question, right? I think, obviously I agree with you that it wasn't Putin's personal decision, right? It had to have been made sort of in the theater and on the ground. I also don't know if it's, the Russian military or sort of some other specific, special forces, like who in the Russian military is actually exercising active control over those facilities, right? So I don't have that information. So that would be an interesting question. Are those people actually specifically trained to handle critical infrastructure protection, or are they not? And sort of what experience do they have doing that? But in terms of when my presentation, I think I referred to sort of the sabotage question, and I was kind of trying to get at that to an extent. I think they would look at it that basically as like being able to control territory and protect themselves and kind of their actions. But in terms of specifically the sort of a dirty bomb threat, I don't know. I mean, it's a good hypothesis, but not sure we know enough or have evidence to sort of support that just yet.
Yeah, all I was thinking is, what if they're worst casing their situation? What could the worst thing that could happen to us? Well, some of the stuff could get out and be used against us. So anyway, that was the thought I had. Okay, can we go on then? What I wanted to do is spend a few minutes going back to my time working national estimates in the intelligence community. Was we would always try to think, when we don't know where things are headed, we don't know the end game, we don't know the outcome, we try to bound the possibilities with some probabilities of what outcome might be more likely than something else. But when you go back just a little bit, for Putin and the Russians, the breakup of the USSR was a catastrophe. I mean, they lost their status as a co-equal to the US in terms of the bipolar world, but probably more important to them, they lost their buffer, which is very critical to them. If you look historically at Russia, and when I was there and working and living in the 1960s, World War II was alive and well in Russia, because they had suffered to a degree that we in the US can't even comprehend. The catastrophe of destruction that took place in the Soviet Union during World War II, initially by their own leadership, but then by the Nazis, of course. But, they were very sensitive to that. And I think we don't appreciate it sometimes. And the NATO, to some extent EU, expansion eastward to their borders through the Baltic states, Hungary, Slovakia, Czech, etc. I mean, to them, this is the nightmare coming to reality. The threat from the West is now on our borders, whereas before we had kept the threat on their borders through our buffer zone of the Warsaw Pact in Eastern Europe. So they are now more vulnerable to what they consider to be the undesirable Western influences, political, economic, to say nothing of having NATO military forces really close to them. So I think we cannot discount the impact that has on them. I think they have a historical knee-jerk reaction. And I can't blame them. I think if we had lived through what they lived through, we'd be the same. Not the new generation of Russians. They never experienced this. But their parents and their grandparents lived through it. And it's alive and well. And I think when Putin pushes this button about, articulating that the fascists are taking over Ukraine, we've got to save the Ukrainians from the evil people coming from the West. That has a ring of truth to a large segment of the Russian population. And I might say that if he lost Ukraine to NATO, that would be, that's just not tolerable. That's the red line. It cannot happen. He will use military forces, he's shown, to prevent that from happening. That may not happen in his calculation, and I think in the general Russian calculation. That's just unacceptable. Next slide, please. And I wanted to mention that when I was working in Kiev in 1969, my wife and I went to a movie theater one night to see a movie about how the Soviets saved Czechoslovakia from the fascists coming from the West. This was a year after the Soviets went into Czechoslovakia on August 22nd, 1968, to save them from the fascists coming from the West. And they showed movies of the Nazi tanks moving into Ukraine in World War II, and then NATO tanks moving into Czechoslovakia in 1968, okay? But the Soviets were defending the Czechs against these evil influences and military forces. And that's the same rhetoric that Putin's using to justify what's going on in Ukraine. I read and watched last night a testimony by 3 Russian POWs who were saying what they had been told they were getting into in Ukraine, and they said, it was a lie. None of that was true. We were told we're defending these people from the fascists. Well, it's the same justification being used now as they used in '68 in Czechoslovakia. So my sense is that Putin's goals, all right, he's got to protect his own position, leadership position, which I think now is becoming more of a concern than it was earlier, seeing the international and national reactions to what's happened. He's got to prevent the NATO forces from being closer to Russia. And he's got to prevent Kiev's westward leaning from affecting eastern Ukraine especially, and southern Ukraine. He's got to protect Crimea. His warm water naval port in Crimea, he's got to protect. That's a strategic thing he's got to protect. And eastern Ukraine just gives him a little more of a buffer between the Russian border and what's going on west of them. And I think he just says, look, I'm going to show these guys out there that I'm serious, and I'm going to use military force to do what I need to do to protect my country's national interests and my national security. Now, I don't think that would, as we talked earlier with Anya, I don't think that will extend to nuclear weapons by any means. But certainly he's demonstrated that he's not going to be bashful. And we're at his red line. And he's going to use and intimidate and bully his way into whatever he needs to do. And I think if you take the next slide, here's my estimate, okay? He's going to definitely occupy eastern and southern Ukraine and Kiev. Very, very likely. That's his goal. That's the minimum he needs to do to accomplish his goals in Ukraine. He needs to control those territories, and he needs to control Kiev until he can have a regime change that follows his dictate. Is he going to occupy all of Ukraine militarily? I don't think so, because that now pushes his forces up towards the NATO border. And I think that's something he doesn't need to do to accomplish his goals in Ukraine. Is he going to allow international organizations to come in and mediate this war? Why should he? He's in control of what he wants. And he's going to tell the rest of the world, just stuff it. This is what has to happen for Russian security. If you don't like it, that's tough, but that's the way life is going to be. Will he withdraw military from Ukraine except for Crimea? I don't think so. He's going to keep what he needs in southern and eastern Ukraine and in Kiev as long as he has to, until the leadership of Ukraine does his bidding without balking at his dictate. So those are as we look at the uncertain future and look at his challenges, he's encountered unexpected Ukrainian resistance. He's got a problem now. He's got an Afghanistan problem. And if NATO gets in there and the supplies keep supplying and so on, he's got a real problem. How severe will the consequences be of the international sanctions? How painful is this going to be for Russia? What's he going to do in reaction to that he hasn't done already? And will this lead to increasing internal dissent and opposition to his leadership. I mean, I'm not so naive to think that he's not in control. He hasn't put how many people in jail, perceived threats to his leadership. But nevertheless, we have a history of revolutions in Russia. So let's not discount that as one of the possible future scenarios. And he doesn't know how NATO is going to respond. I suspect he sees NATO as relatively benign and a paper tiger, that NATO will not do anything, certainly to stop his rampaging through Ukraine with conventional forces. But if he pushes any further, as I said, with nuclear weapons into Belarus and so on, he could get a reaction from NATO that he wouldn't like. So there is a significant uncertainty in his own calculations of where he's headed, and now how he, having caused the damage, the discontent, the hate, and so on, that's now created in Ukraine, he's got to deal with it. He's going to have to handle it. And nobody knows, where it's going. What I tried to do in this is just say, I think this kind of bounds the most likely probabilities of the options he has. But I think the most likely option is he's going to stay in eastern Ukraine, southern Ukraine, protect the Crimea, and he's going to force Kiev to do his bidding, whatever it takes. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Keith. I appreciate that. We need to wrap up, but Anya, I want to give you the last closeout and respond to what Keith said and add whatever you think else we should think about in our final words.
Sure. I just wanted to kind of come in on this last point that Keith mentioned about sort of the response from NATO. It's my personal assessment that I don't think Putin views NATO as a paper tiger, right? So the response from NATO has definitely been uncertain, right? The US and NATO have both tried to sort of signal that they're not going to escalate the conflict beyond that sort of what the Russians understand as regional level, escalated through conventional means. But I think as we're seeing increased lethal aid from individual NATO allies to Ukraine and sort of some of this other assistance, we really don't know how the story ends just yet. So I think there is an understanding that, if improperly handled, the US and NATO can be a pretty formidable foe in combat against the Russian forces, especially in this kind of situation where they have now shown themselves to be slightly disorganized when fighting conventional conflict.
Thank you, Anya. Thank you, Keith. Thank you, NSF, for listening to this very interesting, insightful, somewhat disturbing look at what is going on in Russia right now, or Ukraine right now, and Russia for that matter. And please stay tuned, NSF, please stay tuned for our next series, next sessions in this series. We will be covering topics that you think are important. If you have any particular pressing questions, or you have pressing topics that you would like to see us covered, please send me an email at mccarthy@nationalsecurityforum.org, and I will be announcing our next program probably next week. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you to our speakers. Please, everyone, stay safe. Look forward to seeing you in our next session.